Hey Jeff, how are you?
I'm doing great, Nathan. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited about the progress going on with your project, with History Comes Alive. And I think with everything coming together as it is, thought we could take some time and kind of talk about where you're at in the development process of the episodes and how you've been working to set the stage for the podcast. So give us a little overview here.
Yeah, we've actually got a lot of material. We've made a lot more progress probably than it sounds. I know some folks have listened to me talk about this for a while now. I kept backing up a little bit, and I did that again last week. But the reality is we're getting a running start at American history by backing up a little bit and going over to Europe. A lot of the podcast isn't going to be chronological, so we're going to, kind of focus in and out. I try to think about it, when people ask what the approach looks like. The two things that I've been thinking about are kind of like a whirlpool, or the water going down the drain at the bottom of your sink. It's going round and around the drain, and you're constantly circling the main subject. Or when I was younger, I used to read the old encyclopedias. They used to actually have hard copies for you younger folks out there. They were like real heavy books. And I loved going into the anatomy of the human body because they had all of these transparencies. And so you started with a clear page. The next page was just the human skeleton. And then you would put the flesh on that skeleton, and then the circulatory system and the skin. And then you would have the hair, and each one of these built. And so you're looking at the human body from all these angles. That's really what we've been focusing on with this first series. Is we're going to take a look at a few decades from multiple angles. We're going to keep backing up and coming in closer. So it's pretty exciting. It's not how I had thought of doing the podcast, but I think it's going to be a really kind of interesting view of things.
I think it's an excellent take on it. And from knowing the material and working on the strategy of when to talk about what we talk about, I think it's so key that it's about the approach you're taking to this. We could say this is yet another podcast or curriculum that you're bringing to bear about early American history. And to the extent that a lot of authors treat this, it's just to get deeper, you just go further back or further back. This is more than just going further back and saying, well, let's talk about 1750s leading up to 1776 without changing any constructs or context or actually changing an approach. Talk about how the stage you're setting isn't just about going further back in time, but it's really about what we're saying, it's coming alive. You're unpacking these stories. Could you talk a little bit about what some of those key stories or subtexts going on that are especially relevant to how you're setting the stage?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about it, there's without too much detail, there's four main players the first several decades: Spain, France, the Netherlands, and Britain. And the idea really is each one of those countries, those nation states, they really have their own personality. They're almost like people. And so the reactions that they had in history and the way that they interacted with each other is really like people. And then within the confines of those societies, you've got real men of history, and their attitudes not only largely shaped the nation they were from, but the nation and that culture would shape their attitudes. And the interesting thing of history, what makes it come alive, is when you begin to look at these cultures really as these individuals with their own personalities and their own sets of preferences, and watching how they really started to interact. The world was smaller and bigger at the same time back then. They didn't have a 24-hour news cycle. They didn't have social media. And so the idea of your local community and culture really was the basis for the things that you knew. And watching them interact as a community, it's really interesting to see how some of the same events in history, when you start peeling it back and looking at it from everybody's vantage point, how different some of those things can look. And I think it helps us, again, it helps history to come alive, but it helps us really remember the concepts of history. Again, not so much the names and dates. I'm looking at some of these European names and the names of places or peace treaties, and they're very difficult to pronounce for me. But ultimately, when we're making decisions in life, being able to remember the treaty of such and such and 16 something something is not as important as being able to make a good decision. And that's really the basis of the podcast, is to really help us take a look at contemporary issues and recognize there's nothing new under the sun. People have gone through these things before, and when we start looking at the people and the nations around us as personalities, it makes it a lot easier to kind of come together and wrap our brain around why people do the things they do.
That's fantastic. And Jeff, you mentioned that the idea of not just being another thing about knowing the times and the dates, the titles of the treaties and all those things. I feel like that's often used as the measure for someone that's good at history. They know these things, they know these facts, they have a compendium in their head, and they can spit out when this treaty was, or when this boat came here, or who was alive and who's a contemporary. Throwing those out for a second, not that it's bad to know dates, but why is it really why is it important to be a true student of history, and what does that look like? You mentioned at the end, being able to make good decisions. Talk a little bit about how it's not just about facts, times, date, places, and it's about the constructs and then what you do with it. How does that affect? So maybe to summarize it, what does it look like to be, and why is it important to be a true student of history?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things is as we look at some of the major events in history, adversity can make for strange bedfellows. And, there's a couple of events that happened in Europe just the decades prior to the New World experience, where, you have the Protestant Reformation, where Christendom really split. And you begin to get these nuances. And again, we're coming into a time when national identities are becoming more and more prominent. I mean, it really was the church, and all of Europe was like this, Western Europe was kind of a feudal system to varying degrees. But what you begin to see, though, is, different nations, their personalities are beginning to emerge. So that what happens is people that used to think alike and maybe still do may not be on the same page anymore. Just one precursory, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the St. Bartholomew Day massacre in France and the precipitation of this. And immediately after, you've got really hyper-Catholic folks. And again, all these groups fascinate me. So it's the podcast is not presented in a way that this group was right and this one was wrong. It's really presented in a way of this is what happened. And so you've really got hyper Catholics and more, I would say, moderate Catholics, and then you've got Protestants. And what we see is that, the Catholics, a lot of times the varying groups didn't get along. And so you've got this kind of weird thing after the Reformation where you've got more moderate Catholics, more mainline maybe, national identities that have a lot more in common with a lot of the Protestants. And I find that fascinating. So if you're just remembering, again, like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, you can easily make that a Catholic versus a Protestant thing. And, depending on which side of the fence you're on, you can throw stones at the other one and plenty of blame to go around. But the reality is, if you take the names, places, dates out of it, you start to realize that, boots on the ground, it got really messy. And it wasn't just Catholics versus Protestants. And so when we apply that to our own lives, we begin to realize sometimes, the guy that we don't think we're supposed to agree with, he may actually be right this time. And the guy that we emotionally have an affinity towards, or a lot of similarities in life, he might be dead wrong on something. And, I'm sure every generation says this, but it just seems like we live in a day and an age where, we have a preconceived notion of what the outcome is. And, come hell or high water, the guy on my team is good. I'm going to have to make him look good in the end. And history doesn't unfold that way. And that's what makes it exciting, is to recognize that, like, it's messy, and our lives are messy. And that's okay. It can be messy, and we can have opinions without thinking we got to clobber the other guy, and without always thinking we've got to protect our side. Our side may be wrong. We might switch sides.
That's a great point on reasons why to be a student of history. It helps us in the real world. And you tripped on something that many are thinking about right now. And who is, when you say on our side, and looking at these characters, we've talked about many we'll say famous historical characters and what they're known for, and how when you really unpack it, if you had an affinity to them prior, maybe you don't now, what does that do to destroy other paths and knowledge, pieces of knowledge and times and dates that you thought, or that student thought was important, are now thrown out, and they're rocked, and they say, oh, I can't trust in this person or this group anymore, and find out that they have to, think about things differently. The beauty, I think, of taking this approach, it's about what you say many times, it's not letting your opinions, your politics, etc., inform your history, but really going back and letting your true understanding of history, historical context, sans arrogance, sans hindsight being 2020, but looking at the context from when it happened, letting your history inform your opinions and your politics. And I think that's extremely timely. You said it's every generation. I agree. I think right now is a particularly interesting time for going back and looking at the context of nations founded and groups of people moving, which we'll talk about a lot more. But talk about the next, maybe the first 2 or 3 episodes, and what listeners can expect in those first couple episodes as we wrap up.
Yeah, so I wanted to get the right flavor for why the New England colonies. We're going to start there. If you're going to do American history, you either start in Jamestown. If you want to get really clever, you can say Roanoke, or you start with the Pilgrims. And the conversation has to be broader than that. And so the first series of episodes, I'm going to be recording the last couple of them actually this weekend. The first series really kind of takes a look at who the New England colonies really were. There were a lot of colonies that have been lost to history. You and I have talked about this. Saybrook colony is one, extraordinarily influential at the time, was later absorbed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But where did these people come from, and why were they successful? That's the question. And you really get two camps nowadays. When I was growing up, it was politically correct. The politically correct thing was that they were these pristine, austere people that suffered tremendously, and through just gut-wrenching hardship, they eked out an existence. And then the opposite side of that, now oftentimes we hear of all of the atrocities that were committed and all of the negative things about the hardships and the dictatorial society that they lived in. But the reality is, you can say yes and yes, and you can say it with a smile. All of these things contributed to their success. And so the question that I had in starting this was, well, how do you explain to somebody where that success came from? I mean, these were durable, hardy people. They did do horrible things sometimes. Every people group does. You can't find a plot of land in the world that's currently occupied by a people group that wasn't taken by the previous occupants, right? Nobody gave it up, it was taken. And so what motivated the original British, we'll say, colonists in New England? Who were these people? What was the motivation, and where did they come from? And what you find is, they had been persecuted themselves, mostly politically. But the interesting thing, and the nugget that I really landed on, that we're going to spend a few episodes on, is, the incubation period in the Netherlands was really an incredible time. And this is what led to expanding this out to Spain and France and the Dutch. And you really if you want to understand the Pilgrims and the colonies in New England, you need to understand where they came from, and you need to understand what their experiences were. And they were very different experiences, I think, than we realize. And again, it helps you to be able to say, yep, I wish I didn't read that. I mean, there's some really nasty things going on. But you also say, man, they really built, I have a book upstairs on my shelf, The Puritan Oligarchy. And that really is what they did. I've got another book that talks about Boston was basically designed along the lines of a European nation state, like Florence or Naples, just 100 years or so before New England was settled. And so when we start to look at these people groups that way, that they actually came from somewhere for a reason, and that they're not our little brothers and sisters in American culture. Their thought process, their worldview, everything that they saw and did and experienced was completely different than what we're used to, we have to look at them as foreigners. And I think when you back up and you see where they came from and what their motivations were, you begin to recognize these people aren't, I mean, it's not even about like the religious aspect. Just in general, their worldview, these people are not our little brothers and sisters in our culture. They were a completely different animal than anything this generation's experienced. And you start to get a flavor for that. And it's exciting to be able to see how then the progression as the America got going, and we fight the revolution, and watching that progression of our culture. And you really do realize, though, again, these guys were not us, and we wouldn't fare well in their society, and frankly, they wouldn't fit in very well in ours. And you can appreciate them from a distance, though. I think, we take things more seriously the closer in proximity they are, distance-wise, but I think also chronologically. We're a lot more critical today. I know there's a lot of discussions on a lot of the history threads that I read. Some of these guys like Alexander the Great, it depends on what part of the world you're from, if you like him or not. And it depends how close in relation to his conquest you are to how much you actually appreciate him. We appreciate him a great deal now, 2,300 years later. But if you were in his path, you may not think as well of Alexander the Great as we do today. And that's really how I've tried to approach this, is who were these people? What made them so special and recognized in history? And, why were they so different than us? What motivated them?
And it's aptly named. No, that's a great answer. And it's aptly named in the title, History Comes Alive with Jeff Nichols. I'm excited for the curriculum, the podcast. There's a lot of work that goes into this. And Jeff, who is, if you just want to talk real quick, what is something, if someone's watching this, they want to get in touch with you or interact with you on the subject matter, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, you can always go to Jeff Nichols at historycomesalive.com and Facebook page. You've kind of caught me off guard on that one.
Carrier pigeon. I mean, you're pretty much everywhere.
Absolutely.
What do you prefer?
I am on LinkedIn.
Email?
Yeah, I am on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook, personal page, as well as History Comes Alive. We're going to be launching a website very soon.
Yep. And right now the stage is basically this curriculum, the plan, the material is out there for months, and there's a lot in the works. But if someone's watching this now, and you're watching this and you're interested in collaborating and learning more about the actual program and what Jeff can do with this content and how it's being positioned, for sure, reach out, email, social media, all those things. And it's the time right now, kind of early into midsummer, and later in the summer as we get into whatever this new school year
absolutely
movable target that we're all dealing with. As it gets closer to the beginning of the school year, there'll be a lot more meat on the bones. And in the meantime, it's a great time to collaborate. We'd love to hear from you. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jeff, for diving in a little bit, and we'll check in real soon.
All right. Thanks, Nathan. Take care.